Long before the first courthouse rose on this continent, before gavels and courtrooms and written law, justice was alive in a different form. Among the ancient peoples of the Americas, Mississippians, Puebloans, Iroquois, Inuit, Maya, law was not something carved in stone. It was breathed, remembered, performed. It lived in the stories told around fire, the taboos passed from elder to child, the rituals enacted in moonlight and drumbeat. But even in these sacred systems of balance and reciprocity, there were those who crossed the line, those who betrayed kin, desecrated the sacred, or violated the invisible laws that bound spirit to earth. For them, the worst fate wasn't death, it was exile, to be cast out from the circle of the living, to be stripped of name, of clan, of fire. In ancient America, banishment wasn't only punishment, it was transformation, a ritual severing of the bonds that connected one to identity, land, and story. And while those who were exiled may have vanished from the village, they remained in the cultural memory, sometimes as monsters, sometimes as ghosts, and sometimes as unexpected prophets. Tonight, we journey into the shadowy edge of ancient society to uncover what it meant to be banished, why it happened, and what became of those who were cast out. This is Untold Secrets of Ancient America. And tonight, we follow the forgotten footsteps of the exiled. In the ancient world of North America, justice wasn't centralized. There were no jails, no police forces, no engraved codes of law. But order existed, and it was deeply rooted in spiritual, social, and environmental harmony. Among the Hopewell and Adena peoples of the eastern woodlands, ceremonial mounds were not just monuments. They were sacred landscapes tied to the ancestors and the sky. Violating a burial mound wasn't just disrespect, it was spiritual pollution. The consequence could be banishment, not as retribution, but as purification. Exile was sometimes seen as the only way to restore the balance. The Mississippian culture, which gave rise to cities like Cahokia, functioned around a sacred hierarchy. Chiefs and priest kings governed not only people, but the flow of spiritual power. Offenses like theft, sorcery, or defiance of ritual protocol weren't personal crimes, they were cosmic ruptures. To steal wasn't just to take a possession, it was to interrupt the flow of sacred reciprocity. Sometimes the response was public shame. Sometimes it was offerings. But when the offense was too great, the solution was exile. The offender would be stripped of clan ties, cut off from ceremony, and sent into the unknown. Among the Iroquois, justice was guided by clan mothers, matriarchs who judged whether someone could be forgiven or must be removed. They had the authority to declare a person without a fire, a phrase meaning not just homeless, but cut off from the hearth of the people. Exile was a spiritual severance. In cultures where identity was woven into clan, land, and ritual, losing your fire meant losing yourself. Exile wasn't informal. It wasn't a hasty punishment carried out in anger, it was ceremonial. Among Pueblo societies, accusations of sorcery or spiritual disruption triggered formal responses. A suspected witch, someone thought to have tampered with rain, crops, or health, was brought before community elders. If found guilty, they might not be harmed. Instead, they would be ritually exiled. The act of banishment was surrounded by silence. No one would speak to the person. No one would look them in the eye. They were given a bundle of supplies and told to walk into the desert, into the unknown. Among the Inuit, survival depended on trust and sharing. A single hoarder, a liar, or someone who refused to share meat could doom the entire group. So exile became a terrifying but necessary sentence. In the cold north, exile was often death. The accused would be given a single harpoon and told to go. Some never returned. Some became figures of fear in oral tradition, wanderers of the ice, spirits who howl with the wind. In these societies, to be cast out was to cross into another category of being, no longer family, no longer human, not quite dead, but no longer alive in the way the community understood life. Sometimes tattoos or markings were used, visible signs to warn others not to take the exile in. Sometimes the exile's name was forbidden to be spoken. In that act of silence, the person was erased from memory, as if they had never been. In ancient America, exile was not about punishment. It was about removal, a spiritual quarantine to protect the living world from a force seen as dangerously out of balance. The kinds of crimes that led to exile weren't always violent. Some were social, some were ritual, some were rooted in spiritual terror. In many cultures, the most dangerous crimes weren't physical acts of harm. They were violations of unseen laws. Among the Maya, priests who misread the sacred calendar could endanger the kingdom. A missed alignment, a wrong glyph, a flawed sacrifice, it could offend the gods. These mistakes were sometimes met with removal from temple life or exile to the forest margins. Among the Mississippians, a leader who failed in ritual obligation, who misled a ceremony, disrupted a planting festival, or brought dishonor to a sacred rite, might be stripped of status and cast out. Women, too, were subject to exile, not only for ritual transgressions, but for possessing too much power. Female shamans and midwives walked a thin line between healer and feared outsider. When a healing failed or a drought persisted, suspicion could turn to accusation, and exile would follow. In Pacific Northwest cultures, a chief who violated potlatch protocol by insulting guests, by refusing to redistribute wealth, could be symbolically exiled. Trade would cease. His name would no longer be spoken in ceremony. It was a soft exile, but no less real. And perhaps the most feared crime of all, sorcery. In many cultures, the idea of spiritual manipulation, of harming others through unseen forces, was met not with execution, but with removal. The sorcerer wasn't killed. They were pushed to the edges, into the forest, into the desert, into legend. Exile wasn't always the end of the story. Some never returned. They vanished into forest or ice, becoming whispers in the wind or phantoms in folk tales. Others survived and changed. In some cultures, exiles who endured years alone were believed to have crossed into a new realm of wisdom. Among the Cherokee, a person could return after exile if they underwent purification, fasting, isolation, visions, a ritual rebirth. If the elders accepted the transformation, the exile could rejoin the fire circle. Among the Lakota, there are stories of men who broke taboos, were exiled, and returned years later as Wichashawakan, holy men. Because exile was not just a sentence, it was a journey, a spiritual trial. Some became prophets, others founded new villages. In Amazonian traditions, entire groups of exiles formed new communities along riverbanks. Their descendants told stories of a powerful ancestor who had been wronged and returned in strength, and always the stories linger. In the Four Corners region, oral traditions speak of wanderers with no clan who appear in times of need, bearing strange wisdom. Are they spirits or the descendants of the banished? In ancient America, exile was not a footnote. It was transformation. It was danger. It was rebirth. And in the silence they left behind, The people remembered, not just the crime, but the journey, and the shadows of the exiled still walk among us. In every corner of ancient American mythology, we find the figure of the outsider, not always criminal, but certainly different. And often, these figures mirror the very real people who were once banished. The trickster, the shapeshifter, the lone wanderer, they embody the spiritual imprint of exile, both feared and revered. In Lakota tradition, the Heyoka, the sacred clown, is a paradox, doing everything backward, breaking social norms in ritual ways. Though not an exile in the punitive sense, the Heyoka reminds the community that those on the margins hold sacred insight. Similarly, among the Anishinaabe, Nanabojo is both hero and mischief maker, a trickster who disobeys, who suffers, who wanders. He's often cast out, often punished, but always returns with new wisdom. These mythic figures mirror the banished in real life, the ones who, by breaking taboo or failing to conform, were sent away. In Mesoamerican myths, gods like Tezcatlipoca disguise themselves and walk the earth as outcasts, testing mortals and stirring chaos. In the Amazon, shape-shifting jaguar men represent powerful loners who straddle the line between the village and the forest, between humanity and spirit. These stories didn't arise in a vacuum. They reflect cultural memories of real exiles who became something more. Once a person is cast out, they are free of the rules, but also free to perceive deeper truths. The exile, then, becomes not only a cautionary tale, but a vessel of hidden knowledge. In ancient America, the line between criminal and visionary was razor-thin. Sometimes the person we push away returns not as a monster, but as a mirror. To understand exile in ancient America, we must look at the land itself, not just where people lived, but where they sent those they banished. In the eastern woodlands, dense forests became natural borders between tribal territories. Exiles disappeared into this thick world of shadows, spirits, and hidden dangers. To be alone in those forests wasn't just survival, it was spiritual confrontation. In the southwest, the desert served a similar function. Hot, wide, full of mirages and sacred ruins, it was a place of exile, but also revelation. The Pueblo people believed the land itself listened. To be sent into it was to face the gods directly. Among the Inuit, exile meant the tundra, a flat, featureless, brutal expanse where memory and identity could be lost in white silence. And yet even here, the land held power. Inuits believed certain animals were reincarnated ancestors. The exile walked not alone, but under constant watch. In Mesoamerica, caves and cenotes were both sacred and feared. Some exiles were sent into these spaces, not to die, but to dwell in the in-between. Caves represented the womb of the earth, places of trial and potential rebirth. Some never returned, others emerged changed. Across the continent, exile wasn't just a matter of distance. It was psychological, it was spiritual. The landscapes that surrounded ancient cities and villages weren't empty. They were alive with meaning. To be banished wasn't to be sent away. It was to be sent through the unknown, the dangerous, the sacred. And the land remembered those who walked alone. History is written by the victors, but memory, especially in oral cultures, is shaped by absence. Across the Americas, there are stories of villages founded by mysterious strangers, leaders who arrived from nowhere, holy women who came from the forest with songs no one had heard. Who were they? In many cases, they were the descendants of the banished, or the banished themselves, returned not in shame, but in strength. In some Cherokee tales, The medicine people who brought powerful healing rituals came from clans once exiled. Among the Zapotecs, highland communities preserve origin stories of wandering ancestors. Driven from great cities after betrayal, they became mountain kings. In the Andes, stories of ancestors fleeing destruction and settling in hidden valleys mirror the real consequences of political banishment in pre-Inca civilizations. Even among the Maya, certain powerful lineages trace their roots not to the main city-states, but to individuals cast out and forced to build new temples in the jungle. The Banished became founders, and their stories were reshaped over generations, not as shame, but as divine struggle. Their pain became prophecy. Their exile became a migration myth. Their punishment became a rite of passage. In ancient America, law and justice were deeply embedded in spiritual harmony. But those pushed outside that harmony didn't always vanish. They adapted, they endured, and sometimes they reshaped the world. The legacy of the exiled is not a story of silence. It is a story of echoes, heard in chants, carved in stone, whispered by the wind in forgotten corners of the continent.